they say, everybody has their story, so I have mine. It's not like many of yours. But to tell you my story, I need to go back and say a little bit about my mom and dad, Percy and Ann. Percy was born into a Mennonite family, 10 kids, and though they were religious, his dad religiously made his hard apple cider by the barrel. And when mom and dad weren't around, guess what the kids were doing? They were siphoning off gallons of it, which the parents never missed. And so my father became an alcoholic at a very early age. He would say 5 or 6 years old he started. My mother, her father, worked for Seagram's, whiskey. So the word of the day was, hey, everybody's doing it. Hey, what's alcohol? It's not a problem. Like, we can all do this. Well, by the time my dad was in his mid-20s, late 20s, he realized he had a raging problem. And so he decided he needed to make a geographical and a career change. So he decided to join the Army. The Second World War was going on then, 1941, 42. He thought, that's just what I need. I'll go join the Army, I need some discipline, and this will be all cured. You don't join the Army to get off of alcohol. And they shipped him over to England, trained him to be a chef because he was a baker. He'd lost 2 or 3 businesses by this time because of his drinking. But he thought he could beat it now. Got to England and they shipped him to Italy. On his way to Italy, they were going to stop in North Africa, and his boat got torpedoed by a German submarine. And he, like everybody else on board, had to jump overboard and try to swim for it, but unfortunately, Percy couldn't swim. He did dog paddle to the nearest life raft, and he and a dozen other guys hung onto that rope all night long. But one by one, they slipped into the water and died. Until by the crack of dawn, there was only 2 or 3 of them left. And about that time, a battleship showed up, British battleship. They didn't have to stop for survivors. It was dangerous to stop for survivors. But this captain decided to stop for these survivors. Picked up my dad, and he went on to Italy, and for 4 years, he fought from the south of Italy to the north of Italy. But he was a cook, and as a cook, he had access to the food stores. And so he would take food from the food stores and trade it with Italians for the best cognac wine that they had. Every Italian had their wine cellar. So he would begin his day with a pot of hot wine on his stove, and he sipped on that all day long. And when you do that for 4 years, you're in big trouble. He came home from the Second World War a raging alcoholic. Went into alcoholic psychosis. And because he was a veteran, he was eligible to go to the Veterans Hospital. And he was in and out for 2 or 3 years. And finally, the doctors said to my mother, you'll have to watch the time, John, I'm not watching. The only answer for Percy is he needs to be locked up for the rest of his life. Because when Percy drank, he was a binge drinker. He would not stop until he was either too sick to get out of bed or he was out of money. And also when he drank, he became very violent. And I can still remember seeing him standing with a broken glass milk bottle over my mother and my 2 brothers and I, threatening to kill us. And the doctor said, Percy has to be locked up to protect himself and to protect you. And so they locked Percy up. He was in there for 5 years. After 5 years, one day he got down on his knees beside his bed, and he said, God, you're the only person who could ever get me out of here. About 2 weeks later, the main chef at the hospital needed volunteers in the kitchen. So they asked Percy if he would go and help, and he did. Within a year, he was out of that hospital. He had his mind back, he had his family back, he had a job. He became the chef for the doctors and the nurses of the hospital. He went on to become a businessman and walked with God for the rest of his life. He had 5 sons, and not one of his 5 sons became an alcoholic. My dad had 7 brothers, and 4 of them became raging alcoholics. 2 of my mother's brothers became alcoholics, but none of my brothers have become alcoholics because of God's grace. And so when I was 14, I could see that something radical had happened in my dad, and I knew it was God. And so at 14, I decided I'm giving my life to God. About the same time, I also prayed a prayer. I said, God, someday give me a wife who will love you and honor you and raise our children to love you and to honor you. We couldn't have children, and so God gave us Steve and John, and we adopted them. But we didn't know that when a child is adopted, it's like they've been abandoned. It's like they've been rejected by somebody. And the minute they both picked up alcohol, they just took off. And that was their solution to what was raging inside of them. Well, Colleen and I did all we could to honor God and live for Him and to get involved in things that could help other people. We came across the principle, though we didn't verbalize it, that AAA made very popular in the 30s. And that is, you can only get to keep what you give away. And we started giving away. We became missionaries, became a pastor. And it was while I was pastoring that I came across teaching that taught how the children are so influenced by their childhood, and that there are answers and solutions to those problems. We can forgive those parents. We can repent of our judgments against them, and we can be free. Unfortunately, none of the leaders in my church thought that was a good idea. And so I left the church. I went to work for Shepherds of Good Hope, worked there for 13 years. That's the last stop before you die if you're an addict. There's the mission, then there's the Salvation Army, and then the shepherds. After that, there's the grave. So for 13 years, I saw what alcohol, what drugs did to people. The last program that I worked in there was what they called concurrent disorders. That's with people who have an addiction, have a serious mental illness, and are homeless. That were the qualifications to get into our program. And I worked with those people, and I realized that there were solutions to addiction. There were solutions to mental health. The solution is God. He's not the total cure. It's not that it's all over with, but when you got Him on board, it's a lot easier. And my 2 sons, John and Steve, picked that up and have walked with it, and it's changed their lives. And it can change your life too. So keep up the good work. Thank you.